Recently, a friend of mine was talking about his new campaign idea to return to a more traditional fantasy adventure with inspiration from Tolkien's writings. Now, this is, of course, simply a baseline that will be abandoned based on what I know from my experience with this group. But I feel like it would be valuable to break down what is Tolkienian fantasy and how you can use it to inspire your adventure creation. What is Tolkienian fantasy? Well, it's a medieval European adventure. You have knights, kings, wizards, you're often trekking across hills and mountains. These are things that were really invented by Tolkien. Tolkien created our modern fantasy genre, because you can look back even further back to myth and legend. Every culture has their own myths and legends, but the particulars of this adventure were created by Tolkien, and he is the foundation that most other writings are based on in some way, especially Dungeons and Dragons. Now, the Tolkienian fantasy in particular has limitations because nobody had really thought of these other things like tieflings or dragonborn back when we started modern fantasy. So you have humans, orcs, elves, dwarves, maybe tree folk, and then you have the monsters, which are there to create conflict and tension. Tolkienian fantasy also has a very low magic, or more specifically, an impactful magic to it, rather than the Dungeons and Dragons magic, which can be more explosive in a way. Finally, when we look at a Tolkienian fantasy, we believe that it has this shared history we can all agree on. It seems to be very simple. There are knights, there are warriors, there are wizards. These are things that we will have to agree on. When I think of shared history, you can also think of Baldur's Gate 3 is set in the Forgotten Realms. There are characters there that we might know. So the Tolkienian fantasy has its own world and its own shared history that theoretically we all know. But actually, did you know elves are basically angels in that setting? And that's the reason why we have Rivendell, where there's only a couple elves, and then you've got the mystical sea upon which they sailed away of ancient times. So there's actually a lot more to the history of Lord of the Rings. If you go digging, you'll find out, like in the Silmarillion, it gets way more depth and discussion about how the rings came about, what characters, who Sauron really is. So I would really think about, when you talk about the world, make sure that you guys you have some agreement based on what actually is going on, and one person isn't just hoarding all of that knowledge. Now, one thing we have to talk about when we talk about Tolkienian fantasy and Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is the difference in the books and the movies. There's a tremendous tone change when you move from the book to the movie. The books had much more of a focus on exploration and discovery, whereas the movies were focused on the action, because that is the nature of trying to make that change. Think about the book. Think about how long it takes you to read the book. Reading these books, a trilogy, is in and of itself an adventure. It feels more significant than watching the movies because you have to separate your attention from everything else to sit down and focus fully on the books. It might take a week if you truly committed to reading through all three books. You could watch the movie over the course of a weekend. It's admittedly it's a 9 hour and 17 minute runtime, but you could watch it in a day if you wanted to. I doubt you could read all of the books in a single day. Something interesting about the books is that they suffer from an archaic writing. It's also part of their charm. They were written a long time ago, and nobody has gone through and updated the Lord of the Rings for the modern reader, but I actually think that's very good. So when you read through these, you really have to think about what they're saying, and I think that that is part of the adventure. Your brain absorbs information differently when it is presented as a written piece. Let's think about translating some of this to Dungeons and Dragons. The first thing that I think of is that as I'm presenting this to my players, I really have three modes, and mode number one is limiting my players' choices. You really have to talk to your players and say, okay, well, we can only have humans, dwarves, elves, and maybe halflings, or maybe you can play a half orc. You're not going to be able to play an Asimir. You're not going to be able to play a plasmoid or a slime creature. I run Dungeons and Dragons a lot for children. This is probably not something that I would tell them without the whole group agreeing to it. I actually probably wouldn't run a Tolkienian fantasy for the youth. Choice number two in this is that each player's choices. So if they choose something beyond the core of Lord of the Rings, humans, elves, dwarves, the player's choice becomes the extreme focus, and each player's choice is an extreme focus of your adventure. You have to then go in and make sure that every character that you thought was going to be an elf, well, maybe elves no longer exist, and maybe if your player decided to play a tiefling, or your player decided to play a leonin, well, now you have to take elves, and you're throwing elves to the wind, and you're saying, okay, leonin, you're coming in. Maybe there's no humans in your fantasy adventure. It's really focusing your adventure on characters that theoretically your players could relate to. And the third choice is that every single option has a deep and rich history. This is kind of the nuclear option, is like saying, okay, well, if I can't ever predict my players' choices, and this is a universe with a rich amount of races, of species, of these other things. They all have to have some kind of tie-in to everything that's going on at every moment. So if your players ever encounter somebody, they will receive a sort of character interaction that is important, that moves the plot and story forward. Why use Dungeons and Dragons? And why put it with a Tolkienian sort of theme to it? Well, I actually think that it would be good, because I think that by limiting player choices, or by making player choices more the extreme focus, or more, their choices have this deep, rich history to them, hopefully it will slow down the play, and it will make it more involved, and it will encourage discussion by the players. Also, I really feel like the setting encourages the idea that the characters aren't superheroes. Even though they might be destined to succeed, they're not doing 100-foot leaps. They're not falling 500 feet from an airship and just dropping and hitting the ground and rolling a good acrobatics check and standing up. This brings it back to sort of a level of gritty realism that might be fun for the players once in a while. Now, I mentioned that the players might be destined to succeed. What does this look like? Do players have a chance of failure? Did the characters in Lord of the Rings have the chance of failure? Are the characters in Lord of the Rings heroes? I would argue Aragorn is a great example. He might be an anti-hero. He never intended to become king again. He just ended up that way. But I do think that on some level, when the call to adventure reaches them, each character in Lord of the Rings picks up the desire to do good. So I think that ultimately your players have to have that in them as well. Finally, if you have characters who are destined to succeed, and Dungeons and Dragons is a game of dice, and sometimes it can go horribly wrong, what does it look like if your players fail? If they have some grand and epic conflict ahead of them, what happens if they fail? I mean, personally, for myself, I think that when you just have a diverging path, right? And eventually you come to the same place, but I think that's a really important question to ask, especially if you're playing a more gritty or low magic setting, where you can't just have a god snap their fingers and bring your character back to life. Finally, one more question for relating Dungeons and Dragons to Lord of the Rings. Who is a player and who is an NPC in Lord of the Rings? We have Boromir, we've got Gimli, we've got Legolas. Is Boromir a player or is Boromir an NPC? Is Gandalf an NPC, or is he maybe like a DM PC where the dungeon master has control over this character who has a grand and epic destiny, who has the power to come back to life after death? Is that a player, or is that the dungeon master's character? I want to talk a little bit about the points of divergence between this classic fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons. So Dungeons and Dragons is a system more akin to creating a Marvel-style superheroes than mimicking a traditional fantasy, especially one so old as Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. The youth perspective on Dungeons and Dragons doesn't match up with the traditional fantasy genre. Barring some exceptions, there are definitely players that I have who are more interested in playing the traditionalist elf who is maybe a rogue, and he wants to just go and defeat the big bad, and enjoys the adventure along the way. But a lot of the times I get characters who are, hey, my character is a acid blob man, he wants to grab somebody and melt him down. Or maybe a character who is just a pig. He just wants to be a pig. So I don't think, again, I mentioned this before, I don't think the sort of youth perspective is going to match with this, but I think you can get that special group that sometimes they will absolutely be on board. The adult perspective, however, on Dungeons and Dragons can line up with this very well, but it is extremely dependent on the group. There are a lot of interesting modern perspectives on how to play Dungeons and Dragons, but again, I do think it becomes this sort of Marvel style perspective where you have characters who are getting very, very strong. Because of my next problem, leveling up doesn't make sense in the context of a Tolkienian fantasy. The characters don't get more powerful over the course of the adventure, save Gandalf, who has that big Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White sort of situation. But a lot of the times, the characters are acquiring magic items rather than improving their skills. The conflict between Legolas and Gimli is something that really pops into my head, where they're both probably at the height of their skill, and they're competing for kills in this great big war. But are they really improving? Are they doing something new? It doesn't show them learning a new skill or technique or ability or magic that gets them better. It just says, hey, here are the moves that they've used. So I really think that leveling up doesn't make sense in this sort of adventure. Going back to my comment on the youth earlier, I think that is something that they would not like. They would not like to be stuck at level 2 or level 3 forever. So another reason why this doesn't really match up. The next question is, when you have, so in Lord of the Rings, war is a big part of it. You have multiple wars going on, and you have to ask yourself, does Dungeons and Dragons handle war well? Well, if you look at it from the perspective of a series of smaller encounters, yes, you can easily kind of describe this war as just combat, and that's fine. That's not a problem. What about monsters? Well, actually, the Tolkienian fantasy has monsters. It's got Shelob. It's got the spiders in the woods. It certainly has orcs. You definitely encounter orcs frequently. But I do find that these monster encounters in Lord of the Rings, in The Hobbit, tend to be way more potentially deadly than people really think, because we follow our character who is destined to succeed. So with Dungeons and Dragons, where you have a monster that has a stat block, and if your players roll poorly, it kills them, how does this really mesh? Well, you do kind of have to make it so your players will inevitably either succeed or that they can flee at the end of a combat. Magic is a big problem. So, magic in Lord of the Rings is real and visible. It is all around the characters. However, it's usually in the form of items and environments or things from ages long past. Nobody in Lord of the Rings is really making magic items. There is a reforging of a very special magical sword, but could you tell me what the qualities of that magical sword are? As so far as we know, realistically, it's just, hey, it demonstrates that you are the one true king of this place from a long time ago. Consider that one of the ring wraiths was defeated with the fact that a character was not a man. That's it. This is magic in Lord of the Rings is very silly, but also fun in a way that makes very satisfying narrative sense. Magic in Dungeons and Dragons is all about fireball. It's all about blowing things up or enhancing your abilities. It's commonplace, and I think that the world of Dungeons and Dragons actually hasn't adapted to how commonplace magic is. And I don't think that meshes well with a setting that is pure Tolkienian fantasy. In Lord of the Rings, a lot of the times you will have characters who possess magic and are going to do evil with it. Certainly you have a group of characters who are good to the players, who are good to the main characters of the story, and bless them in some way, but a lot of the times that good magic comes with consequences. I love that. I wish I could implement that more often in my games, but it runs into the problem of Dungeons and Dragons, where when a player encounters a problem, they just want to blow things up. They just fireball, lightning bolt, haste, shrink. I I think that meshing these two things, I think you really have to talk to your players and say, hey, look, I think I really have to curtail all of these magic abilities that you have and make it so that you are really accessing only a couple of them. And you don't have things like prestidigitation where you can just solve any problem instantly by vanishing some soil. Why do we even have prestidigitation? Spell slots don't make sense. How much magic does Gandalf actually do? I mean, he fights the Balrog, but how does he fight the Balrog? So far as we know, he's blocking its attacks. Does he cast light on his staff? I think in order to run this, you really need to restrict the amount of magic your players have access to. Restrict their abilities severely. And I don't think that's a very fun thing to do in Dungeons and Dragons. I think there are other systems that can support it better, but I do think this is a good starting point. As time goes on, you have to accept that with Dungeons and Dragons, things will get crazy. Talking to your players, you can negotiate the adventure you want to be on without making the game unmanageable. That is ultimately what I have decided. I think you and your players should definitely use these tools to get together and talk about where you want the fantasy to start from, where you want your adventure to start from, and eventually you'll have a lot of fun. Things will get crazy from there, but make sure that every player choice is very important. That is it. That is all I have to say on this matter. My name has been Ian with Young Adventurers Guild. I run Dungeons and Dragons for adults, for kids. If you want to hire me to run Dungeons and Dragons, or you would like to put a youth into one of my D&D programs, you can find me on a system called Six Crickets or Start Playing Games. I hope to hear from you, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you.